Greetings, everyone. Today's lecture will be brought to you from Wakanda. Today, we're going to be talking about superheroes, and I'm going to be making the argument that they represent our 21st century mythology. So earlier this semester, we talked about Joseph Campbell and how he argues that we live in a demythologized world. In other words, we don't teach mythologies, already existing mythologies, to kids and new generations, and that we also fail to make new modern mythologies. I completely disagree with this. And what I want to argue is that we don't do this in the ways that we have in previous generations, but that we have a medium, the comic book and now the comic book movie, which essentially do this very thing. We teach old mythologies to new generations, and we also create our new mythologies that represent the values and the ideas of our current ages. And so I think Campbell's wrong. We do live in a mythologized world. It's just a new form of mythology, and that mythology is the comic book and the comic book film. So let's review briefly why we have mythology in the first place, right? At the beginning of the semester, we talked about the functions of mythology, the purposes of mythology, and ultimately, let's boil those down to two main principles. We are able to retain the values of the past. We're able to share those values with new generations. We're able to emphasize what we think is important for our society and important for our traditions and our history. And then we are able to understand the challenges of the present. And so mythologies help us to know what we valued in the past and how to apply those values to the present. And so that is exactly what comics allow us to do. I grew up with Superman. That was my father's favorite comic book character. And Superman comes to represent those ideas of truth, justice, and the American way. Those are values that we want to inculcate and enculturate for the next generation. And so all sorts of different values are expressed in comics. I'll talk about them over the course of the lecture. But if the goal of mythology is to know what we've valued in the past and how to apply that to the present, then that is exactly what comics do. And that's exactly the purpose that comics serve for us today. So the concept of comic books originates in the 18th century in Japan. And this phenomena is known as manga. Japan is still the world's largest market for comic books. And I'll talk a little bit about manga in a minute. In the United States, as well as the United Kingdom, comic books originally started as like a collection of comic strips that were being published in mainstream newspapers. And so they started as just collections. But in the late 1930s, a couple of important comic book characters were created specifically for the genre of the comic book, such as Superman and then later Batman. And so that really kicked off what we now know as comic books. Today, the US market is dominated by three major forces: manga and manga publication. Actually, more manga is sold in the United States than English language or, American made comics. And then we have two big comic houses, DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Of course, there are lots of other small independent publishers, but the market is dominated by those three groups: manga producers, and then DC Comics and Marvel Comics. So I've talked a little bit about manga. Manga actually begins in long-standing Japanese traditions of cartooning. And these go all the way back to the 17th and 18th century. Japan is a very art-oriented society. And so the idea of reading these cartoons in a unified book form becomes popular and codified in the late 19th century to what is known as manga today. Manga as a term can refer to any comic book that's produced in Japan or even today in the Japanese style. Comic books that are produced in a Japanese style in the United States are often kind of mislabeled as manga or just called manga, even though they don't quite fall into the true definition of being created in Japan. Today, comic books are mainstream in the United States and people of all ages read comics, but that definitely wasn't true through a lot of comics history. In the United States, comics were often relegated to kids and seen as like a kid or teenager interest, but that's not how it works in Japan. Manga is read by people of all ages in Japan, and it always has been. It is not seen as a child's activity, it's seen as a social activity. So manga covers all sorts of different topics. all sorts of different genres. You can find manga of all different styles, and everybody reads them, right? So it's not limited to a certain age group. There are manga for women, there are manga for men, there are manga for elderly people, there are manga for kids. And it's seen as a normal social activity, the way that like reading a newspaper would be. Now, we also have the phenomena of the graphic novel, which is a little bit different than a comic book because graphic novels are longer form rather than being serial. So rather than you getting a new edition of a comic every 2 weeks or every month that continues the story like a television episode would, graphic novel is more like the movie, right? It's a longer scale, full length story. The entire story is told, completed from beginning to end within the graphic novel, but it uses illustrations in addition to text. So that's why it differs a little bit from your mainstream novel. Graphic novels can be both young adult or adult. One of the most famous graphic novels, for example, is Mouse. And Mouse is famous because it won a Pulitzer Prize, right? So graphic novels can be seen as high literature and can be seen as ways to explore really deep, dark, complex ideas and themes. We'll talk about a few graphic novels as the lecture goes on, but this is slightly different than comic books in that comic books are serial and graphic novels are complete stories that are self-contained. So when we look at the history of comic books, we really talk about 4 eras, although to be completely honest, we should be talking about 5 eras, and I'll explain why. But the first is the golden age of comics in the 1930s and 40s. This is when comic books in their modern form were created in the United States, and 2 of the most iconic characters, Superman and Batman, were created. So this is the beginning of the superhero as a mythology, the 1930s. And in many ways, they were a response to the Great Depression, as well as growing social tensions that would lead to World War II. And so this is when we see the proto-superhero. They are not particularly complex. They're not morally like ambiguous. Like Superman is like a Boy Scout in tights, right? So ideas were very simple. Morals were very clear. There was not a lot of moral ambiguity. The good guys were the good guys. The bad guys were the bad guys. The bad guys were usually organized crime or like outsiders from other countries that we couldn't trust. However, these fall out of popularity right after World War II. The superhero kind of gets shoveled off to the side because everybody has heroes, the war heroes that come back from the war. And so instead they become more focused on romance and horror. They also get focused on like sex in some ways that people don't like. So by the end of the 1940s, comic books kind of fall out of popularity. So this golden age is the beginning of the genre, but there aren't actually a lot of famous comics from this period, and probably you've never seen one of them in real life. In 1954, we see the Comics Code Authority be created. And what this is that there was a lot of social uproar about comic books causing juvenile delinquency. If we look at like the 1990s and the early 2000s, we see the same argument being made about video games and rap music, right? So every once in a while, society decides, oh no, we need to understand why young kids act out. And the answer is because they're young kids. We got to blame it on something in the media. So in the 1950s, that blame fell on comics. And so the Comics Code Authority was actually created by the comics industry as voluntary self-censorship. And it is founded in 1954, the same year as those McCarthy witch hunt Red Scare hearings. So it was part of that social tension, part of that questioning of social mores and questioning of our morality. The Comics Code Authority no longer exists. It was abandoned by the industry in the early 2000s when people realized that like we really didn't need it anymore. Comic books could publish what they wanted. Like by the late 90s, most of the comics industry had disregarded it anyway and were kind of flouting it. And so by the early 2000s, they just kick it to the curb. So starting in 1956, 2 years after the Comics Code Authority was created, we see DC publish the Flash #4, which was a return to the superhero comics. So 1956 is seen as the beginning of the Silver Age. And it's called the Silver Age, but this actually is kind of like the golden age of comic books. This is the glory days, the heyday heydays from 1956 to 1970. This is when a young creative guy called Stan Lee pairs up with a really great artist named Jack Kirby, and they create Marvel Comics to rival DC Comics, which had already existed for about 30 years. And we see an explosion of talent in both writing and illustration, as well as technological advances that allowed more colors to actually be printed in the comics. Early comics only came in yellow, red, blue, and then black and white. But as the 60s progressed, we see new colors being introduced into comic books because the technology gets better. This is the highly collectible era. This is, like I said, it's the Silver Age, but really it's like the heyday, it's the pinnacle, it's the golden ages of comics. And this is when we see the creation of the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man over at Marvel. This is when Wonder Woman is created at DC. This is when Superman gets a lot more complicated. This is when most of Batman's most important villains are created. This is also when we see the beginnings of some of the smaller houses grow into the independent publishers that would rival or compete with Marvel and DC. After the Silver Age, we get to the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age has the same heroes, but they begin really addressing social issues of their time. So we see a lot of minority-driven and female-driven superhero storylines. This is when like Catwoman starts to get her own storylines. This is when Supergirl and Batgirl come out. This is when the X-Men expand and you see a lot of minority characters, and you start dealing with storylines related to homosexuality, storylines related to race relation. A lot of comics during this time deal with issues of racism, classism, gender inequality, economic inequality, etc. And we also see a revival in the 1970s to the early 80s of horror and supernatural stories. So this is when we see the Dracula comics become popular again, and like witch-related comics. So some of the storylines that we saw in our witches, werewolves, and vampires sections of the course. In 1986, Alan Moore publishes The Watchmen. And The Watchmen is one of the most important graphic novels ever written. It is a commentary on superheroes itself. And so it's very meta. It's very much a comic that's a commentary on comics, and a superhero story that's a commentary on superheroes. It was made into a film a few years ago. It's an excellent film I recommend checking out. I recommend reading The Watchmen, but it is dark and it is brooding, and the superheroes aren't good guys. They do awful things, and some of them are terrible people. But there is a certain like nobility to their cause, and etc. And so the modern age, which many scholars argue goes from 1986, when Alan Moore published The Watchmen, up to the present, includes a lot more dark themes. Batman becomes like a dark and brooding character that is really complex and morally questionable. During this time period, Superman like abandons the United States and becomes a global citizen. We see more graphic depictions of violence. We see more sexuality. This is when Spawn comes out. This is when we see a lot of questioning in the X-Men universe about morality, and a lot of the questions about like technology and humanity. And so this is a new, more, I don't know, engaged view of comic books, what comic books can be. They can really be complex moral literature that doesn't just go, oh, truth, justice, and the American way, but does something a lot darker and more complex than that. Now, a lot of people argue that the modern age goes from 1986 to the present, but I would kind of counter that and say that we are in a postmodern age of comic books. DC Comics is folding. They were bought out by Time Warner and are kind of closing up shop. Marvel, now that Stan Lee is gone, has pretty much moved into almost entirely digital format. And the idea of like buying comic books at your local comic shop has kind of disappeared. At the same time, comic books are more popular than ever, and comic book superheroes are more popular than ever, thanks to the DCU, the DC Universe, and the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the billions and billions of dollars that they have made through their films. And I start the postmodern age in 2000, because in 2000 is when there was the successful launch of the X-Men movie trilogy. And that's like the Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart X-Men trilogy. They got two high-quality theater actors, right? Hugh Jackman did Broadway. Patrick Stewart was part of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they actually took the superhero film seriously. Of course, there had been, Reeves' Superman and other superhero films before. But starting in 2000 with the X-Men series, we see the beginning of what would be this new explosion of comic books being mainstream and presented to a mainstream audience. And so I consider this the beginning of the postmodern age, where all of a sudden everyone is into comic books. Even people who had never read comic books before are now into the superheroes, and the superhero mythology becomes important to us. And I would argue that part of the reason that this happens starting in 2000 is because in 2001 we have 9/11, and this completely changes the way that we think about like public safety, and we think about public good, and the idea of superheroes, people who are noble and strong and have magical powers or technological advances or super skills, will come and save us from what was like a shocking horror, airplanes flying into buildings. Like all of a sudden it wasn't just guys with guns, it was on a bigger scope and scale. And so we needed heroes to help us defeat these villains that were on a bigger scope and scale. And so we stopped being interested in witches and werewolves and vampires, which are small scale, and we wanted to see truth, justice, and the American way again. We wanted to see Captain America, who's an embodiment of those values. We wanted to see Iron Man, the technological marvel who could save us from the big baddies, right? We wanted to see these moral questions. Even, bringing Black Panther to the screen was a commentary on race relations in the United States. So we are starting to address the complex questions of today in a new way by emphasizing the superhero as a new kind of hero and monster, right? The villains are basically super villains themselves. They go above and beyond normal man. And so that's why we now are in this postmodern age where superheroes represent something bigger. They represent these ideals that we've always had, but they represent needing someone bigger than ourselves in order to deal with the size and scope of the problems that we have today. But I've got to ask, what is the difference between comic superheroes and mythical superheroes, right? Wonder Woman is an Amazonian princess. Thor is the god of thunder from Norse mythology. Black Panther is the traditional leopard skin chief. This idea that, well, comics are just, poor pulp fiction for, kids and lower rents, whatever. Comic books are the Shakespeare of our time. They deal with social issues, they appeal to the masses, but they also teach us our history and teach us our old stories, right? So Wonder Woman is that Amazonian princess. We have a direct connection to old mythologies with Ares and Athena. We have Thor, which is a connection to Norse mythology. Black Panther, a connection to African mythologies and African mythos and characters. So who is to say really that, oh, this is just low rent pulp fiction for kids? No, this is the mythology of our times, and this teaches us the mythology of our times by taking those mythological characters and putting them in a format that anyone can consume and anyone can appreciate. And so now we have our art and literature in a new format, but it still expresses American values. Superman represents America's ideas of truth and justice. He is good with a capital G, and he represents protecting the innocent and sacrificing the self. You have Batman. Batman is a commentary on mental illness. All of the villains represent, mental illness to the extreme. The Joker archetype represented in the Joker and Harlequin. The genius taken to the extreme that is the Riddler. Catwoman and the Penguin representing different ideas on economics and social class, right? The thief and the aristocrat turned into animals. Batman himself is a kid who suffers childhood trauma and never gets over it, and so basically has PTSD and turns into a superhero. If you think about it, Batman is a commentary on wealth and mental illness, and the combination of the two. Let's leave the DC universe and go to the Marvel universe. Spider-Man is a commentary on science, right? He is bit by a radioactive spider, and all of the villains in Spider-Man are scientists gone awry. So Spider-Man is really about our questioning of science itself and the way that we can understand science and the way that science can become dangerous. X-Men is probably the greatest example of this. Stan Lee has said, I created X-Men in order to represent those who are underprivileged in society and to be able to tell stories that weren't being told in comics. X-Men is a metaphor for the LGBTQ struggle, and it's a metaphor for race relations. X-Men has always been a multiracial, multi-identity group of people, right? The villains, the same way. You have all sorts of different creations, all sorts of different powers that are represented in different ways, good and evil. But ultimately, it's about outsiders who are being discriminated against in society, trying to find their place in society. And so various storylines in the X-Men universe represent those ideas of, how are homosexuals being mistreated in society and how do we integrate them into society? The ideas of women being oppressed. There are lots of strong, powerful female characters in the X-Men universe, including Storm, an African queen. You have Wolverine, the outsider with the heart of gold, right? So all of these ideas expressed in X-Men were really metaphors for our society dealing with social exclusion, dealing with racism, classism, homophobia, etc., told through superheroes. And so X-Men really is like one of the most important examples of 20th and 21st century literature that captures our social issues and our social values. And so writing off comic books as just a joke is really misunderstanding the power of the stories and the mythologies that are created in comic book form. But in addition, comics, especially in the past few years, have come to be our postmodern mythologies about what a new future could look like. And the best example of this is the Black Panther film, which came, of course, from the Black Panther comics that have existed for decades. But Black Panther is a truly African view of what the future could be. And it is a globalized African view. One of the great things about the Black Panther film is you've got actresses like Lupita Nyong'o, who is a Mexican Kenyan. You have, an emphasis on not using colonial accents, but developing an African accent. The imagery that is used of Wakanda is a beautiful view of what Afrofuturism can be. And so comic books also allow us to, again, not just look at our past and not even to just discuss our current values and our current debates about social issues, but even to look at what our future could be, a more inclusive future, a future where representation matters, a future where people of different perspectives have equal views and we all can appreciate the beauty and the verisimilitude that comes from having different cultures live together in harmony and work together in harmony. We also, in the Black Panther film, get to see strong, powerful women be scientists, be fighters, be diplomats, right? You have these three female characters that represent different views of what a woman could be. And Black Panther also created a villain, right, in Killmonger, who asked us real moral questions. It wasn't just good versus evil. It was a commentary on what race relations really could be in America and how we should think about race in a more egalitarian way. And in that sense, it wasn't just black and white good, the hero is good and the villain is bad, but both of them had good and bad in them and had to question what that morality meant. That is what great literature does. That is what mythology does. And so Black Panther, in my opinion, represents that pinnacle of mythology in our society. Heroes that were complex, morality that was told, and new visions of what the future could be in new and exciting ways. So we shouldn't say that we live in a demythologized world. We live in a very mythologized world, and that mythology is expanded in comic book form, in television form, in movie form, so that it can reach a wider audience than ever. It teaches us our old mythologies, it creates for us our new mythologies, and it gives us an opportunity to reimagine our moralities in new and exciting ways. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture on superheroes and how important they are as a modern mythology, and I look forward to debating it this week in section. And if you haven't, please go and watch Black Panther, because truly it is our greatest mythology for the 21st century. And you want to be a part of that. You want to learn that mythology and share in the communitas of all of us experiencing it together. All right, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you guys later.